26 children disappeared on a school trip in 1986. 40 years later, the school bus is found buried. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Now let's begin. Margaret Hargrove had learned to live with silence. At 72, she moved through her small Vermont home like a shadow, careful not to disturb the dust, the memories, or the neighbors who still remembered her name for all the wrong reasons. Every morning, she watered the plants on her windowsill, geraniums mostly. They didn't ask questions, they didn't whisper when she walked by. Her routine was simple. Tea at 6, toast at 7, and by 8 o'clock she'd be sitting in the worn armchair by the window, watching the town wake up. The same houses, the same streets, the same quiet judgment that had followed her for nearly 40 years. But it was the sound that haunted her most. Every weekday morning just after 8:15, the school bus would rumble down Maple Street. The engine growled low and steady, brakes hissing at the stop sign 2 houses down. Margaret would freeze, her hand trembling around her teacup, her breath catching in her throat. The yellow paint, the square windows, the children's laughter spilling out into the crisp morning air. She never looked directly at it. She couldn't. Because every time that bus passed, Margaret was back in 1986, the spring that changed everything. The spring her brother Frank took 26 children on a school trip and never brought them home. Frank had been a good man, quiet, hard-working, a little lost after the factory closed. When he got the job as a school bus driver, he'd smiled for the first time in months. "A fresh start, Maggie," he'd said, using the nickname only he ever called her. "Things are looking up." 3 weeks later, he was gone. The children were gone, and Margaret became the woman people crossed the street to avoid. Her daughter, Emily, had left town at 19. "I can't breathe here, Mom," she'd said, tears streaming down her face. "Every time someone looks at me, I see it. They think we're part of it, that we knew something." Margaret hadn't fought her. How could she? She understood. Now, decades later, Margaret lived alone in the house where Frank had once sat at her kitchen table, drinking coffee and talking about second chances. The house where Emily had grown up before the world decided their last name was a curse. She'd never left town. Some people thought it was stubbornness. Others thought it was guilt. Margaret wasn't sure anymore. As the school bus disappeared around the corner that Tuesday morning, Margaret set down her teacup and closed her eyes. Her hands were still shaking. Then the phone rang. It was an old rotary phone, the kind that jangled harsh and loud, demanding attention. Margaret rarely received calls. She stared at it for 3 long rings before slowly reaching for the receiver. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was official, careful, apologetic. "Mrs. Hargrove, this is Sheriff Dawson. I need you to come down to the station. There's been a development. We found something." Margaret's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" she whispered. There was a pause. Then quietly, "We found the bus, Mrs. Hargrove, after all these years, we finally found it." Margaret's hand trembled as she hung up the phone. They found the bus. The words echoed in her mind, impossible and terrifying. For 38 years, that yellow school bus had existed only in nightmares and newspaper archives. It was a ghost, a question mark that had swallowed 26 children and her brother whole. And now it was real again. She stood frozen in her small kitchen, the morning light streaming through the curtains, the tea kettle whistling on the stove. Everything looked the same, but nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret turned off the stove with shaking hands and reached for her coat. The drive to the sheriff's station took 12 minutes, but Margaret barely remembered it. Her old sedan moved through the familiar streets on autopilot, while her mind raced with fragments of memory. Frank's face the morning he left, Emily's small hand, waving goodbye from the porch, the frantic phone calls that afternoon when the bus never arrived at the nature center. When she pulled into the station parking lot, she noticed something odd. There were news vans. 3 of them, satellites extended toward the gray Vermont sky like metal flowers, reaching for sun. Reporters clustered near the entrance, cameras ready. voices sharp with anticipation. Margaret's stomach dropped. They already know. She tried to slip past unnoticed, but a young reporter spotted her immediately. "Mrs. Hargrove! Mrs. Hargrove, do you have any comment on the discovery?" Margaret kept her head down, walking faster. "How does it feel to finally have answers after all these years? Did you know your brother was—" Sheriff Dawson appeared at the door, his weathered face stern. "That's enough. Give her space." He gently guided Margaret inside, his hand firm. On her elbow. The station smelled like burnt coffee and old paperwork. Margaret had been here before, too many times in those first terrible months after the disappearance. Interrogations, questions, the same horrible questions over and over. Sheriff Dawson led her to his office and closed the door. The sounds of the reporters faded to a dull murmur. "I'm sorry about the circus out there," he said quietly. "News travels fast in a small town. Faster when it's a story this big." Margaret sank into the chair across from his desk. "Where did you find it?" "Riverside Road. You know the area near the, old mill? There was a bad storm 3 days ago. Opened up a sinkhole near the riverbank." He paused, choosing his words carefully. The bus was buried there. Deep. Covered in mud and debris. If that storm hadn't hit exactly where it did— 38 years, Margaret whispered. "It was there the whole time." "Looks that way." Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. "And the children?" Sheriff Dawson's expression softened with something like pity. "The investigation team is still processing the scene. It'll take time. But Margaret," he leaned forward, "we found belongings. Personal items, things that tell us that they were there for a while." The room tilted slightly. They were there for a while, not an instant tragedy, not a quick ending. They had waited, hoped, called for help that never came. "I need you to prepare yourself," Dawson continued gently. "This is going to get bigger before it gets smaller. The media, the families, everyone's going to want answers. And they're going to look at you." "They've always looked at me," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "I know." He slid a business card across the desk. "If you need anything, protection, support, anything, you call me directly, understand?" Margaret took the card with numb fingers. As she stood to leave, Dawson added, "Margaret, one more thing. We found a notebook in the bus. Belonged to your brother. We'll need to examine it, but I thought you should know." Margaret's heart stopped for the second time that morning. Frank had left something behind. Margaret drove home in a daze, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The news vans had multiplied by the time she left the station. 5 now, maybe 6. Cameras turned toward her car as she pulled away, recording every moment of her escape. By the time she reached Maple Street, the first reporters were already there. 2 of them stood on the sidewalk across from her house, cameras pointed at her faded blue shutters and overgrown garden. Margaret pulled into her driveway and sat there for a moment, trying to gather the strength to face them. She didn't have to wait long. A young woman with perfectly styled hair approached her car window. "Mrs. Hargrove, Channel 7 News. Can you tell us what you're feeling right now?" Margaret kept her eyes straight ahead and walked to her front door without responding. "Do you believe your brother was responsible for what happened?" The key shook in Margaret's hand as she unlocked the door. "The families deserve answers, Mrs. Hargrove. Don't you think they deserve to know the truth?" Margaret stepped inside and closed the door, leaning against it as her breath came in short gasps. Through the window she could see them setting up camp on the street, waiting, watching. The phone started ringing 20 minutes later. Margaret let it ring, again and again. Each time it stopped, there was a brief moment of silence before it started again. Finally, she unplugged it from the wall. At noon, there was a knock at the door. Margaret peered through the curtain. Mrs. Chen from next door stood on the porch, holding a covered dish. For one brief moment, Margaret felt a flutter of hope. Maybe someone in town still cared, still remembered she was human. She opened the door. Mrs. Chen's face was tight, uncomfortable. She thrust the dish forward without meeting Margaret's eyes. I made extra casserole. Thought you might need something. Thank you, Margaret said softly, taking the dish. That's very kind. I should go. Mrs. Chen backed away. Quickly, glancing at the reporters across the street. My husband doesn't think I should be seen here. With everything happening. You understand. She was gone before Margaret could respond. Margaret stood in her doorway, holding the casserole, watching Mrs. Chen hurry back to her house as if proximity to the Hargrove home might be contagious. She closed the door and set the dish on the kitchen counter. Only then did she notice the note tucked underneath. Please don't talk to my family. We want no part of this. Margaret's hands began to shake. By evening, 3 more notes had appeared. One slipped through the mail slot. You should have left town years ago. Another tucked under her windshield wiper. Some sins don't deserve forgiveness. The third taped to her mailbox. Those children are crying from their graves. Can you hear them? Margaret sat at her kitchen table as darkness fell. The unsigned notes spread before her like accusations. Outside, the reporters had set up lights. Her small house glowed on the evening news, a symbol of tragedy reborn. Her phone, still unplugged, sat silent on the counter. She was alone. Completely alone. Just like she'd been for 38 years. But something was different now. The bus had been found. Frank's notebook had been found. And whether Margaret wanted it or not, the past was clawing its way back to the surface. She looked at the notes again, the cruel anonymous words, the judgment she'd carried like stones in her pockets for decades. And for the first time in a very long time, Margaret felt something other than shame. She felt anger. Margaret woke the next morning to find her mailbox overflowing, not with bills or advertisements, with letters, dozens of them, some in neat envelopes with return addresses, others hastily scribbled on torn notebook paper, a few with no postage at all, hand-delivered in the night. Margaret stood on her porch in her robe, staring at the pile. She reached for the first envelope. Her hands hesitated, then pulled it open. Dear Mrs. Hargrove, my name is Patricia Wilson. You don't know me. But my son David was on that bus. He was 10 years old. For 38 years I've wondered where he was. If he was scared, if he called for me. Now we know. And I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I'm not writing to blame you. I'm writing because I need to understand. Did your brother say anything before that day? Did he seem different, worried? Please, if you know anything at all. The letter ended there, the signature shaky and tear-stained. Margaret's chest tightened. She opened another letter, then another. Some were desperate pleas for information. Others were filled with rage, demanding answers she didn't have. One simply said, "He took my daughter. Tell me why." Margaret sank onto her porch steps, letters scattered around her like fallen leaves. These weren't anonymous notes. These were real people, parents, siblings, people whose lives had been shattered just like hers. She wanted to throw the letters away, burn them, pretend they'd never arrived, but she couldn't. At 11 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up in front of her house. Margaret watched from the window as a woman in a dark suit emerged, carrying a leather folder. She was in her 50s, with kind eyes and the careful posture of someone who delivered bad news for a living. The reporters perked up immediately, cameras swiveling. The woman ignored them and walked directly to Margaret's door. The knock was gentle but firm. Margaret opened the door a crack. Yes. Mrs. Hargrove, my name is Linda Morrison. I'm with the Victim Services Department. She kept her voice low, respectful. May I come in? Just for a moment. Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside. Linda entered quickly, closing the door before the cameras could get a clear shot. Inside, she turned to Margaret with genuine sympathy. I know this must be overwhelming. That's one word for it, Margaret said quietly. Linda opened her folder. There's going to be a memorial service in 2 weeks. The families have been planning it since the discovery was confirmed. She paused. They'd like you to attend. Margaret's breath caught. Me? You're part of this story, Mrs. Hargrove, whether you want to be or not. Linda's voice was gentle but honest. Some families want to meet you, to ask questions, to find closure. And the others? Some are angry. Some blame your brother. Some blame you. Linda met her eyes. But most just want the truth. Whatever truth there is. Margaret walked to the window, looking out at the reporters, the letters still scattered on her porch, the town that had never let her forget. What if I don't go? She asked quietly. That's your choice, Linda said, but they're going to hold this memorial, with or without you. And if you're not there to speak for yourself, she let the sentence hang. Margaret understood. Her absence would be its own statement. Her silence would be interpreted as guilt. Linda placed a formal invitation on the coffee table. Cream-colored paper. Gold. Littering? In memory of the 26th, a community remembrance service, May 15, 2024, Riverside Community Center. You have 2 weeks to decide, Linda said softly. But Margaret, speaking as someone who's seen a lot of grief, sometimes the only way through is to face it. She let herself out, leaving Margaret alone with the invitation. Margaret stared at it for a long time. 2 weeks? 14 days to decide if she had the courage to walk into a room full of people who had spent 38 years wondering if her family had destroyed theirs. The next few days brought a flood of information, and none of it made sense. Margaret stopped unplugging her phone. She needed to know what people were saying, even if it hurt. The first call came from Sheriff Dawson. We've released some preliminary findings, he said carefully. I wanted you to hear it from me first. The bus was, found approximately 15 miles from the planned route, near an old logging road that hasn't been used in decades. 15 miles? Margaret's mind raced. But that doesn't make sense. Frank knew these roads. He grew up here. I know. That's what we're trying to understand. That evening, the news showed aerial footage of the discovery site. The reporter's voice was somber. Investigators are puzzled by the location. The bus appears to have traveled far off course before coming to rest in this remote area. Questions remain about why the driver would have taken this route. Margaret stared at the television screen, trying to make the pieces fit. 2 days later, a different story emerged. The local newspaper published an interview with Thomas Brennan, a retired mechanic who had worked at the school district garage in 1986. I serviced that bus 3 days before the trip, he said. There was nothing wrong with it, but Frank seemed distracted. He asked me strange questions about alternate routes to the nature center, said something about avoiding traffic. Margaret read the article 3 times. Frank had asked about alternate routes. He'd never mentioned that to her. But then another voice contradicted it. Helen Martinez, who had been the school secretary, told a different reporter. Frank was nervous about the trip. He told me his bus had been making funny noises. He was worried it might break down with all those children on board. Margaret's head spun. Which story was true? More fragments surfaced daily, each one adding confusion rather than clarity. A former teacher remembered Frank seeming perfectly fine that morning. A parent recalled seeing the bus leave and thinking the driver looked upset. One witness claimed they'd seen the bus heading north. Another swore it had gone west. Margaret sat at her kitchen table surrounded by newspaper clippings, trying to piece together a coherent picture. But every new detail contradicted the last. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Sheriff Dawson called again, his voice strained. Margaret, we found something in the bus, letters, written by the children. Margaret's breath stopped. They're dated. The first one was written the day they disappeared. The last one, he paused. The last one was written 4 days later. 4 days. They were alive for 4 days, Margaret whispered. We believe so. The letters talk about being cold, about hoping someone would find them, about, his voice cracked slightly, about singing songs to stay brave. Margaret closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. There's something else, Dawson continued. Some of the letters mention your brother. They say he left to get help, that he told them to stay inside where it was warm and he'd come back with rescuers. Margaret's world tilted. He left them? She asked. He left them and went for help? That's what the letters indicate, but Margaret... Dawson's voice grew heavy. We haven't found any trace of your brother. Not in the bus, not in the surrounding area. It's like he vanished. After the call ended, Margaret sat in silence. Frank had left the children to save them. He'd gone for help, but he'd never come back. Why? What had happened to him, and if he'd been trying to save them? Why had everyone spent 38 years believing he was responsible for their deaths? Margaret stood in the cereal aisle of Carter's Market, trying to decide between 2 boxes of oatmeal she couldn't afford, when she felt someone watching her. She'd learned to recognize that, feeling over the years, the weight of eyes, the hushed whispers, the sudden silence when she rounded a corner. But when she turned, the woman standing 3 feet away wasn't whispering. She was just looking. Her face was gentle, sad, and somehow familiar. You're Margaret Hargrove, the woman said. Softly. It wasn't a question. Margaret's hand tightened on her shopping basket. Yes, I'm Shirley Coleman. The woman stepped closer, and Margaret saw she was probably in her mid-70s with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun and eyes that carried decades of sorrow. I don't expect you to remember me. But Margaret did remember. Slowly, painfully, the memory surfaced. Your daughters, Margaret whispered. Anna and Beth. Shirley's eyes filled with tears. You do remember. Anna and Beth Coleman. Twin girls 8 years old. Margaret had seen their pictures in the newspapers for years after the disappearance. 2 identical smiles, gap-toothed and hopeful. I'm so sorry, Margaret said, her voice breaking. I'm so terribly sorry. I know you are. Shirley's response was unexpected, warm. I've watched you all these years, living in that house, never leaving, never hiding, but never really living either. Margaret felt exposed, vulnerable. I came to find you today, Shirley continued. I've been coming to this market every Wednesday for 38 years, hoping I might run into you, hoping I'd have the courage to speak. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Shirley glanced around the store. Can we sit just for a moment? There's a cafe next door. 10 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a small corner booth, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them. The letters they found in the bus, Shirley said quietly. One of them was from Beth. She wrote that a man told them stories to keep them from being scared, that he promised someone would come. Margaret's throat tightened. My brother. Your brother tried to save them. Shirley's voice was firm. For 38 years I believed he'd done something terrible. That he'd taken my girls somewhere dark and... She couldn't finish. But he didn't. He tried to help them. He failed, Margaret said bitterly. He tried. Shirley reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over Margaret's. That matters. Margaret looked down at their joined hands. 2 women, bound by grief, by loss, by a spring day in 1986 that had shattered both their worlds. Everyone blames me, Margaret whispered. They always have. I know. I blamed you too. Shirley's honesty was painful, but somehow kind. It was easier than accepting that sometimes terrible things happen for no reason, that good people can try their best and still fail. Are you going to the memorial? Margaret asked. Shirley nodded. I've been to every remembrance event for 38 years, even when no one else showed up, even when the town wanted to forget. She paused. But this one feels different. This one feels like an ending. Or a beginning, Margaret said softly. Shirley studied her. You should come. Not because you owe anyone anything, but because you deserve to grieve too. Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest, a wall she'd built so carefully, so deliberately, for so many years. I found out something else, Shirley said, her voice dropping. They haven't made it public yet, but one of the investigators told me. They found medication in the bus, prescribed to your brother. Margaret's eyes widened. What kind of medication? For anxiety, for confusion. Dated 2 weeks before the trip. Shirley's expression was pained. Margaret, was your brother ill? Margaret's mind raced back. Frank had been struggling, yes. After losing his job, he'd been different, quieter, more withdrawn. But ill. I don't know, she admitted. He never said anything. Maybe. He didn't know how, Shirley said gently. They sat in silence for a long moment, two women carrying secrets too heavy to hold alone. Finally, Shirley stood. I come here every Wednesday at 2 o'clock. If you ever want to talk, I'll be here. As she turned to leave, Margaret called out, Shirley, why are you being kind to me? Shirley looked back, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Because holding on to hate didn't bring my daughters back, and neither will holding on to blame. The news broke on a Thursday evening. Margaret was washing dishes when her television, left on for background. Noise suddenly went silent. Then a new voice, urgent and reverent. We interrupt this program for a special report. Margaret dried her hands slowly, turning to face the screen. The reporter stood outside the sheriff's station, holding a folder with obvious care. Tonight, authorities have released transcripts of letters found inside the recovered school bus. These letters, written by the children themselves during their final days, offer a heartbreaking glimpse into... Margaret sank onto her couch, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. The reporter's voice continued, measured and respectful. We want to warn viewers that while these letters contain no graphic content, they are deeply emotional. The families have given permission for select portions to be shared, hoping that the public will finally understand what happened in those 4 days. The screen shifted to show typed text, read aloud by the reporter. Dear Mom and Dad, Mr. Frank says we have to stay in the bus where it's warm. He went to find help. He said to be brave. I'm being brave. Love, Jessica. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. It's cold, but we're singing the songs from music class. Mr. Frank taught us a new one. Before he left, he said singing keeps the scared away. Tommy is sharing his crackers. We're okay, please come find us. Day 3, still waiting. Mr. Frank hasn't come back yet. Maybe he got lost too. Sarah says her mom always finds her, no matter what. I hope that's true. The reporter's voice wavered slightly. These letters paint a picture of children who remained hopeful, who comforted each other, and who trusted that help was coming. Margaret wept openly, not bothering to wipe away her tears. The children had believed in Frank. They'd trusted him to save them. And he'd tried. God. He'd tried. By morning, the letters were everywhere. Newspapers printed them on front pages. Radio stations read them between songs. The internet exploded with hashtags. The 26, never forgotten. Spring of '86. Margaret's phone rang constantly. She didn't answer. But she did listen to the voicemails. Some were cruel. Your brother killed those children with his incompetence. Others were surprisingly kind. Thank you for carrying this burden all these years. I'm sorry we made it harder. One message stood out. Mrs. Hargrove, this is David Chen. I'm a reporter, but I'm also from this town. My uncle went to school with your brother. I don't want to exploit your pain. I want to tell the full story. The real story. If you're willing to talk, I promise to listen with respect. Margaret saved that message. 3 days later, the sheriff's office held a press conference. Margaret watched from home, her curtains drawn against the reporters who still camped outside. Sheriff Dawson stood at a podium, flanked by investigators. His face was drawn, tired. We've completed our preliminary analysis of the personal items recovered from the bus, he began. Along with the letters, we found drawings, songs written out in careful handwriting, even a small birthday cake made from crackers and wrapped in paper. The screen behind him showed photos, careful, respectful photos that didn't reveal too much but showed enough. A child's drawing of a house with a sun overhead. The words, "Happy birthday, Tommy," spelled out in crayon. These children, Dawson continued, his voice thick, created a community inside that bus. They cared for each other. They maintained hope. And according to their own words, the driver, Frank Hargrove, instructed them to stay together and warm while he went for help. A reporter called out, "Why didn't he make it back?" "We're still investigating. The terrain was treacherous. There was a storm that week, but one thing is becoming clear." Dawson paused, choosing his words with care. Frank Hargrove was not a villain. He was a man who found himself in an impossible situation and made a choice to try to save those children. "Then why did he take that road in the first place?" another reporter shouted. "We don't know yet, but we've found evidence suggesting he may have been experiencing a medical episode, disorientation, confusion." Dawson's eyes found the camera, and Margaret felt like he was speaking directly to her. "We believe Frank Hargrove needs to be remembered not as a monster, but as another victim of that terrible day." That night, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. The knock came just after sunset. When Margaret peered through the window, she saw a young woman, maybe 30, with dark hair and red-rimmed eyes. Margaret opened the door cautiously. "I'm Rachel Porter," the woman said softly. "My mother was Jessica Porter. She was on the bus." Margaret's breath caught. Jessica, the girl who wrote about being brave. "I was born 6 months after she disappeared," Rachel continued. "My grandmother was pregnant with me when—" She couldn't finish. "I never knew my mom, but I grew up hearing stories about her, how kind she was, how she loved to sing." "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered. "I read her letter today, the one they released." Rachel's voice broke. "She was being brave, just like everyone always told me she was." "She was very brave," Margaret agreed softly. Rachel looked at Margaret with searching eyes. "Everyone blamed your family. I grew up thinking your brother was evil. But that letter, my mom trusted him. She wrote that he was kind." "He was," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "He really was." "Then something went terribly wrong," Rachel said, "and I think it's time people stopped punishing you for it." She handed Margaret an envelope. "I'm part of a group. Children of the 26. Most of us were born after or were too young to remember. We're organizing a counter-narrative. We want the truth told with compassion, not anger." Margaret took the envelope with shaking hands. "You're invited," Rachel said gently, "to meet us, to tell us about your brother, to help us understand." As Rachel walked away, Margaret opened the envelope. Inside was a card with a simple message. "You are not your brother's keeper. You are his sister. There's a difference. We'd like to hear from both." Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Rachel's words echoing in her mind. "You are not your brother's keeper. You are his sister." But what if being his sister meant she should have seen the signs? Should have known something was wrong? At 3 a.m, Margaret gave up on sleep. She pulled on her robe and walked downstairs, past the darkened living room to the door she rarely opened anymore. The basement. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob. She hadn't been down there in years, maybe a decade. It was where she'd stored everything from before, everything she couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bring herself to throw away. Margaret flipped the light switch. The single bulb illuminated a cramped space filled with boxes, old furniture, and the accumulated weight of a life spent standing still. In the corner sat 3 cardboard boxes labeled in faded marker, "Frank's things." She'd packed them herself in the months after the disappearance, when his landlord had needed the apartment cleared. No one else had wanted to do it. His ex-wife had already moved away. There were no other siblings, no parents left. Just Margaret. She pulled the first box toward her and sat on the cold concrete floor. Inside were ordinary things: a flannel shirt still smelling faintly of his cologne, a coffee mug with a chipped handle, a paperback novel with a bookmark stuck halfway through. He'd never finished it. Margaret's hands trembled as she touched each item, memory flooding back. Frank at her kitchen table wearing that shirt, telling her about the bus driving job. It's honest work, Maggie, simple. I just drive kids safely from point A to point B. How hard can that be? She'd smiled at him, relieved. He'd been so lost after the factory closure, after his marriage fell apart. This job felt like hope. But had she looked closely enough? Had she seen past his smile to the exhaustion underneath? Margaret opened the second box, papers, bills, a lease agreement, and there, at the bottom, a small bottle of pills. She pulled it out with shaking hands. The label was still legible. Prescribed to Frank Hargrove. Take one daily for anxiety. Anxiety, the bottle was nearly full, he'd barely taken any. Margaret's chest constricted. She remembered now, Frank mentioning he'd seen a doctor. She'd asked if everything was okay. He'd waved it off. Just stress, nothing serious. They gave me some pills, but I don't really need them. She'd believed him. Or maybe she'd wanted to believe him. The truth was more painful. She'd been relieved he'd said it was nothing. Because if it was something, she'd have to deal with it. And she'd been so tired back then, working 2 jobs, raising Emily alone. It had been easier to accept his reassurance than to dig deeper. Margaret pressed the pill bottle to her chest and wept. Hours later, as dawn light crept through the basement window, Margaret opened the third box. This one she knew. This one she'd opened before, late at night, when the guilt became too heavy to bear. Alone. Frank's personal journal. She'd found it in his apartment, tucked in a drawer. She'd read it once, then hidden it away, too frightened by what it contained to show anyone. Not the police, not the families, not even Emily. For 38 years, this notebook had been her secret. Margaret opened it with trembling hands, turning to the entries from the weeks before the disappearance. 15th, 1986. The roads are confusing me lately. I drove my usual route today and somehow ended up 2 streets over from where I meant to be. Took me 10 minutes to figure out where I was. I'm probably just tired. March 22nd, 1986. Had a strange moment today. Couldn't remember if I'd already made my morning stop or if I'd missed it. One of the kids had to remind me we'd already picked up the Jefferson Street group. I laughed it off, but I'm worried. Is this what getting old feels like? I'm only 44. April 2, 1986. Voices in my head lately. Not real voices. Just thoughts that feel like someone else is thinking them. Take the back road. The main road is dangerous. The children aren't safe. I know it's just stress. The pills the doctor gave me might help, but they make me feel foggy. I'd rather be clear-headed while I'm driving. Margaret's tears fell onto the yellowed pages, smudging ink that was already faded with time. April 10th, 1986. Big trip tomorrow. Nature Center. The kids are excited. I am too, I think, but I keep having this feeling that something's wrong. That I need to take a different route. Keep them safe. God, I sound crazy writing this down. I'm fine. I'm always fine. Stop worrying, Frank. That was the last entry. Margaret closed the notebook and held it against her heart. She'd read these words 38 years ago and made a choice. A choice born of fear and shame and desperate hope that maybe, somehow, Frank had just gotten lost. That maybe it was an accident. That maybe showing this notebook, with its confused ramblings and untreated illness, would make everything worse. She'd told herself she was protecting Frank's memory. But the truth? She'd been protecting herself. Because if she'd shown this notebook, people would have asked questions. Why didn't you notice? Why didn't you help him? Why didn't you stop him from driving that day? And Margaret hadn't known the answers. She still didn't. As morning light filled the basement, Margaret thought of Emily. Her daughter had been 9 years old when Frank disappeared. 9 years old when their world imploded. 9 years old when she started getting bullied at school. When other children whispered that her uncle was a monster. When parents pulled their kids away from her at the playground. Margaret had watched it happen, had tried to protect her. But how do you protect a child from an entire town's judgment? And then, at 19, Emily had left. "I can't breathe here, Mom." Margaret had let her go, had thought it was the right thing, to let Emily build a life somewhere else, somewhere clean, somewhere without the stain of the Hargrove name. But maybe Emily hadn't just been running from the town. Maybe she'd been running from Margaret too. From a mother who'd chosen silence over truth. From a mother who'd hidden evidence that might have helped people understand. From a mother who'd been too afraid to fight. Margaret looked down at the notebook in her lap, the pills in her hand, the truth she'd buried for decades. Sheriff Dawson had said they'd found Frank's medication in the bus, that they were investigating whether he'd been experiencing a medical episode. But they didn't have this journal. These words that showed Frank had been struggling for weeks before, that he'd known something was wrong and had been too proud, too frightened, or too confused to get proper help. This notebook could change the narrative completely. It could also destroy what little remained of Frank's dignity. Margaret sat in the cold basement, torn between two impossible choices. Continue protecting a dead man's reputation, or finally tell the truth and let the pieces fall where they may. Outside, she heard the morning sounds of Maple Street waking up, the school bus rumbling. Past. Life continuing as it always had. But for Margaret, sitting in the basement with her brother's secrets, nothing would continue the same. She had a choice to make. And this time, she couldn't choose silence. Margaret carried the notebook upstairs and placed it on her kitchen table. For 3 days, it sat there, untouched, accusing. Every time she walked past it, she felt its weight, not the physical weight of paper and cardboard, but the crushing weight of decision. The memorial service was 9 days away. The letters from the families kept coming. The reporters multiplied outside her house, and Margaret felt like she was drowning in the center of a storm that would never end. On the 4th day, Sheriff Dawson called again. "Margaret, we need to talk. Can you come down to the station?" "I'm not feeling well," she lied. "This is important. We found more evidence, witnesses who remember seeing your brother in the days before. I don't want to talk about it." The words came out harsher than she'd intended. There was a pause on the line. "Margaret, I understand this is difficult. You don't understand anything." Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. "You weren't there. You didn't live through what I lived through. You didn't watch your whole life fall apart while people whispered and pointed and blamed you for something you had no control over. I'm trying to help you. Then leave me alone." She hung up before he could respond. That afternoon, Shirley appeared. At her door. Margaret saw her through the window but didn't answer the knock. "Margaret, I know you're in there," Shirley called gently. "I brought soup, homemade. Please, just open the door." Margaret stayed silent, pressed against the wall beside the window. After a long moment, she heard Shirley. "Set something down on the porch. I'll leave it here. I know things are getting harder, but you don't have to face this alone." The footsteps retreated. The car door closed. The engine started and faded away. Margaret waited 10 minutes before cracking open the door. The soup sat there in a covered container, still warm, with a note. "Wednesday at 2 p.m. I'll be waiting." Margaret left it on the porch. The hate mail increased. Every day brought new letters, new accusations, new demands that she leave town, confess her sins, stop pretending to be innocent. You knew. You had to know. Your silence makes you complicit. Those children died because your family failed them. Margaret stopped reading them. She let them pile up on the floor by the door, a mountain of paper judgment she stepped over every time she entered or left. David Chen, the reporter who'd left the kind voicemail, showed up in person. "Mrs. Hargrove, I just want 5 minutes. No. I'm not like the others. I genuinely want to understand." I said no. Margaret started to close the door. "Those children deserve the truth," David said, his foot blocking the door. Something inside Margaret snapped. "The truth?" Her voice rose, sharp and bitter. "What truth? That my brother was sick and nobody helped him? That the school gave him a job without proper screening? That I watched him suffer and was too ignorant to understand what was happening?" She was shaking now, years of pent-up rage finally breaking through. Everyone wants the truth, but nobody wants to hear that maybe we all failed those children. Not just Frank, all of us. The doctors who didn't take him seriously. The school that didn't train him properly. Me, for not asking the right questions. Her voice broke. But it's easier to blame one dead man and his sister than to accept that sometimes tragedy happens because everyone makes small mistakes that add up to something terrible. David stared at her, his notepad forgotten in his hand. "Now, get off my porch," Margaret said quietly, "and don't come back." She slammed the door. That night, Rachel Porter called. "Mrs. Hargrove, the group I told you about, we're meeting tomorrow evening. We'd really love—" "I'm not coming, but we want to help you tell your story." "I don't have a story." Margaret's voice was flat, empty. "I have 40 years of guilt and blame, that's all. That's the only story there is." "That's not true. You don't know me, Rachel. You don't know what I've done, what I've hidden." Margaret looked at the notebook on the kitchen table. "You think I'm some kind of victim, but maybe I'm exactly what this town always said I was." "Mrs. Hargrove," Margaret hung up. She unplugged the phone again, drew all the curtains, locked the doors. In the silence of her dark house, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook one more time. She read Frank's confused entries, his fears, his struggle to understand what was happening to his own mind. And she thought about Emily. Her daughter had sent one letter after the bus was found. One short note. "I saw the news. Are you okay?" Margaret hadn't responded. What could she say? "Yes, I'm fine, even though I've been carrying your uncle's secrets for decades and it's eating me alive?" No. Better to stay silent. Better to let Emily keep her distance, keep her clean life in whatever city she'd escaped to. Margaret had already ruined enough lives. She thought about the memorial service, about Linda Morrison's invitation, about walking into a room full of grieving families and facing their questions. Their anger, their desperate need for answers she couldn't provide. She thought about Shirley's kindness, about Rachel's hope, about Sheriff Dawson trying to help. And she realized something. She didn't want their help. Because accepting help meant accepting that maybe, possibly, she deserved forgiveness. And Margaret wasn't ready to forgive herself. The notebook sat open before her, Frank's handwriting shaky and uncertain in those final entries. The children aren't safe. He'd been trying to protect them, in his confused and broken way. He genuinely believed he was saving them by taking that back road, by getting them away from some imagined danger. And it had killed them. Not malice, not cruelty, just illness, confusion, and a tragic series of choices made by a sick man who didn't know he was sick. Margaret closed the notebook. She could give it to the authorities, could show them that Frank's mental state had been deteriorating for weeks, could provide the missing piece that would finally make sense of why he'd driven off course, why he'd made those decisions. Or she could burn it, could take this final piece of evidence and turn it to ash, could let people keep believing whatever they wanted to believe because the truth, that mental illness had stolen Frank's judgment and destroyed 26 innocent lives, was too painful for anyone to bear. Margaret stood and walked to the fireplace. She held the notebook over the cold ashes from last winter. Her hand trembled. One match. That's all it would take. But as her fingers tightened on the worn cover, she heard a sound outside. Footsteps on her porch. Then a soft knock. Margaret froze. "Mrs. Hargrove?" A voice. Young, female, uncertain. "Mrs. Hargrove, it's Emily." The notebook slipped from Margaret's fingers and fell to the floor. Her daughter had come home. Margaret stood frozen, staring at the door. Emily, her daughter, here. After 20 years of silence. She walked slowly to the door, her legs unsteady. Through the peephole, she could see a woman in her 40s. Emily's age now, though. Margaret's mind still held the image of a 19-year-old girl walking away with a single suitcase. Margaret opened the door. They stood facing each other across the threshold. Emily looked tired. her dark hair streaked with premature gray. She wore a simple coat and clutched a purse against her chest like a shield. "Mom," Emily said softly. The word broke something inside Margaret. "You came." "I saw the news, the letters, the memorial announcement." Emily's voice wavered. I thought maybe you needed someone." "I'm fine," Margaret said automatically. Then softer, "I'm not." "Fine." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening. "Can I come in?" Margaret stepped aside. They moved to the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, close enough to talk, far enough to maintain safety. "I have 2 sons," Emily said finally. "Jacob is 12. Daniel is 9. Margaret's breath caught. Grandchildren. She had grandchildren she'd never met. "They don't know about this," Emily continued, gesturing vaguely toward the window, the reporters outside, the past that had swallowed their family. "I told them we were estranged, that it was complicated." "It is complicated," Margaret whispered. "I was angry for so long, Mom." Emily's voice cracked. "Angry at you for staying here, for not fighting back, for just accepting what everyone said about us. I didn't know how to fight." "I know." Emily wiped her eyes. "I understand that now, but back then I was just a kid, who wanted her mother to fix everything." They sat in silence. "I can't stay," Emily said finally. "I have a hotel room. The boys are with my husband back in Portland. I needed to see you, to know you were okay." Margaret nodded, understanding. This wasn't reconciliation, not yet. This was a door opening a crack, letting in the first sliver of light after decades of darkness. "The memorial," Emily said. "Are you going?" "I don't know." "Mom." Emily reached across the space between them, her hand hovering uncertainly. "Whatever you decide, I'll be there, not for Uncle Frank, not for the families. For you." Margaret took her daughter's hand. They held on tight, 2 people trying to find their way back to each other across a canyon of lost time. After Emily left, promising to return in the morning, Margaret stood alone in her living room. The notebook still lay where it had fallen by the fireplace. She picked it up with trembling hands and looked at the phone, plugged back in after Emily's visit. Sheriff Dawson had said they needed more evidence. The families needed answers. Emily had come home hoping her mother would finally stand up. Margaret thought of Frank's confused words. The children aren't safe. He'd believed he was protecting them. His sick mind had convinced him of danger that didn't exist. This notebook explained everything, and Margaret had hidden it for 38 years. She picked up the phone and dialed. "Sheriff Dawson, it's Margaret." "Hargrove." Her voice was steady for the first time in weeks. "I have something you need to see. Something I should have shown you a long time ago." Sheriff Dawson arrived within the hour, accompanied by an investigator Margaret didn't recognize. They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Frank had once shared coffee and hope about his new job. Margaret placed the notebook between them. "I found this in Frank's apartment after he disappeared," she said quietly. "I read it once, then I hid it." Dawson opened the journal carefully, his eyes scanning the entries. His expression shifted. From curiosity to understanding to something like sorrow. "Why didn't you come forward with this?" he asked gently. "Fear, shame, I thought." Margaret's voice broke. "I thought showing it would make everything worse, that people would say I should have known, should have stopped him. You weren't, responsible for your brother's illness," Dawson said. "Wasn't I?" Margaret met his eyes. He was struggling. "I saw it but didn't want to see it. It was easier to believe he was fine." The investigator made notes while Dawson read through the journal. Finally, he looked up. "This changes things. Margaret, this shows Frank was experiencing confusion, possibly delusions. It supports our theory that he genuinely believed he was protecting those children. Will it help the families? It might help them understand." Dawson closed the notebook gently. "Truth doesn't always bring peace, but it's better than not knowing." Margaret nodded, feeling lighter and heavier all at once. She'd finally told the truth. The news broke the next morning. Sheriff's Department releases new evidence in 1986 case. Bus driver may have been experiencing medical crisis. Margaret watched the story unfold from her living room. The notebook's contents, carefully summarized to protect Frank's dignity while revealing the truth, spread across every news channel. The reactions came swiftly. Patricia Wilson, mother of David, released a statement. "This helps us understand. It doesn't erase the pain, but it removes the mystery. Frank Hargrove was sick, not evil." Others were less forgiving. Anonymous comments flooded online. "Mental illness isn't an excuse. Why did his family let him drive?" Shirley called. "You did the right thing, Margaret. It took courage." Rachel Porter appeared at her door with tears in her eyes. "Thank you. My mother trusted him. Now I understand why." But not everyone was kind. Someone spray-painted Margaret's mailbox. "Too little, too late." A woman confronted her at the grocery store. "My son died because your brother was crazy. That's supposed to make me feel better?" Margaret stood in the aisle, accepting the anger, knowing she deserved it. Emily appeared beside her. "That's enough," she told the woman firmly. Then to Margaret, "Let's go home, Mom." The memorial service was 2 days away. Margaret sat at her kitchen table with Emily, sorting through old photographs. They'd spent the morning in silence, carefully handling images of Frank from better times. "He looks happy here," Emily said, holding up a photo of Frank at a family picnic, years before everything fell apart. "He was," Margaret said, "before the factory closed, before he lost himself." Emily set down the photo. "Mom, can I ask you something? Did you ever blame yourself?" Margaret's hands stilled. "Every single day. But you know it wasn't your fault, right? You couldn't have known how sick he was." "Knowledge and feeling are different things," Margaret said softly. "I know, logically, that mental illness isn't visible, that Frank hid his struggle, that even doctors missed the signs." She paused. "But my heart still asks, what if I'd paid closer attention? What if I'd pushed him to keep taking his medication?" Emily reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. "What if?" Everyone who ever interacted with those children asked themselves the same thing. The school administrators who didn't require mental health screenings. The doctors who prescribed medication but didn't follow up. The society that stigmatized mental illness so much that Uncle Frank felt he had to hide it. Margaret looked at her daughter with new eyes. "We all failed them, Mom. Not just you. Not just Uncle Frank. All of us, collectively, as a community, as a system." Emily's voice grew stronger. "But you're the only one who's been carrying the weight alone." Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks. "The memorial," Emily continued, "it's not just for the children, it's for everyone who needs to let go, including you." That evening, Linda Morrison stopped by with final details about the service. "Several families want to speak," she explained. "Shirley Coleman will read a poem, Patricia. Wilson will share memories of her son. And," she paused, "they're asking if you'd be willing to say something about Frank, about what you've learned." Margaret's chest tightened. "I don't know if I can." "You don't have to," Linda assured her. "But if you want to, the platform is there." After Linda left, Margaret sat alone thinking about Frank's journal, about the children's letters, about 38 years of silence. She picked up a pen and a piece of paper, and for the first time since 1986, Margaret Hargrove began to write her own truth. The morning of the memorial service arrived. With soft rain, Margaret stood at her bedroom window, watching water streak down the glass. Emily appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Ready?" Emily asked gently. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready. The Riverside Community Center was filled to capacity. Margaret and Emily entered through a side door to avoid the cameras. Inside, the room was decorated with simple elegance. White flowers, photographs of the 26 children arranged on a memorial wall, candles flickering in the dim light. Families filled the rows of chairs. Some faces Margaret recognized, aged by decades of grief. Others were younger, siblings, children of the lost, people born into the shadow of that spring day. Shirley saw them and waved, gesturing to saved seats in the middle section. Not front and center, but not hidden in the back, a place of belonging. As they sat, Margaret felt eyes turn toward her, some curious, some angry, some simply sad. The service began with music. A children's choir sang Amazing Grace, their young voices filling the space with bittersweet beauty. Patricia Wilson spoke first, her voice steady but thick with emotion. She shared memories of her son David, his love of baseball, his gap-toothed smile, his dream of becoming a veterinarian. For 38 years, Patricia said, I lived in the space between not knowing and not accepting. Now finally I understand what happened. And while it doesn't bring David back, it lets me lay him to rest properly. Others spoke. Parents, siblings, Rachel Porter representing those born after, reading letters from children who'd never met the 26 but carried their memory forward. Then Shirley stood and read her poem, simple, honest words about loss and time in the slow work of healing. As she returned to her seat, the pastor stepped forward. We have one more speaker today, he said gently. Margaret Hargrove has asked to share something. The room fell silent. Margaret felt Emily's hand squeeze hers. She stood on shaking legs and walked to the front, looking out at the sea of faces, some kind, some guarded, all waiting. Margaret pulled a folded paper from her pocket. Her hands trembled so badly the paper rattled. She cleared her throat. My name is Margaret Hargrove, she began, and for 38 years I've been afraid to speak. Her voice cracked, but she continued. I was afraid because I thought silence would protect my brother's memory. I thought if I didn't talk about his illness, people might remember him as he was before, kind, hard-working, hopeful. She paused. But silence didn't protect anyone. It only prolonged the pain. She looked at the photographs of the children. Frank took 26 beautiful children on a trip they never came home from. And I need you to know, he was sick. His mind was betraying him. He believed he was protecting them when he took that back road. He believed danger was coming and he was being a hero. Tears streamed down her face now. He was wrong. Tragically, devastatingly wrong. And those children paid the price for his confusion, for a system that didn't catch his illness, for my ignorance, for all our collective failures. She folded the paper, her prepared speech abandoned. I can't give you back what was taken. I can't undo that day, but I can tell you that I'm sorry, so deeply, profoundly sorry. And I can promise that I'll spend whatever time I have left honoring those children by telling the truth. Even when it's hard. Even when it hurts. Margaret looked directly at Patricia, at Shirley, at Rachel. They deserved better. You all deserved better. And I'm sorry it took me 38 years to find the courage to say that out loud. She returned to her seat in complete silence. Then, slowly, Shirley stood and began to clap. Others joined. Not everyone. Some sat with arms crossed. Unmoved, but enough. Enough to tell Margaret that speaking had mattered. After the service, Margaret stood outside in the rain, breathing deeply. Emily appeared beside her with an umbrella. You did it, Mom. It doesn't feel like enough. It's a start. Shirley approached, her eyes red but smiling. There's something we'd like to show you, if you're willing. She gestured to a small group gathering near cars, Patricia, Rachel, and a few others. We're going to the site, Shirley explained. Where they found the bus, we're planting flowers, creating a small memorial garden. She paused. We'd like you to come, if you want to. Margaret looked at Emily, who nodded encouragement. I'd like that, Margaret whispered. The caravan of cars drove slowly through rain-slicked streets to the outskirts of town, down Riverside Road, to the place where the earth had finally revealed its secret. The area was marked now with yellow tape and official signs. But someone had already begun to transform it, planting flowers, placing stones, creating beauty from tragedy. The group gathered in a circle. Margaret hung back, uncertain of her place, but Shirley took her hand and pulled her into the circle. One by one, each person planted a flower and spoke a name. Anna Coleman, Beth Coleman, David Wilson, Jessica Porter. When it came to Margaret's turn, she knelt in the mud, rain mixing with tears on her face. She planted white roses, Frank's favorite. For the 26, she said, softly. And for Frank, who loved them enough to try, even when his mind couldn't show him the way. As she stood, Patricia stepped forward and embraced her. Then Shirley, then Rachel. Not everyone joined. Some stood apart, their grief too raw, their anger too deep. And that was okay. Healing didn't require everyone to forgive. It only required the courage to face the truth together. As the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light over the memorial site, Margaret stood with Emily beside her. "Mom," Emily said quietly, "I'd like my sons to meet you. Their grandmother." Margaret's breath caught. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Emily squeezed her hand. "They should know where they come from. The whole story, the pain and the love and everything in between." Margaret looked out at the flowers swaying in the breeze, at the families gathered in grief and tentative hope, at the road that stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer walked alone. She wasn't healed. Neither was this town. Neither were the families. But they were walking, moving forward, together and separately, carrying their grief, but no longer crushed beneath its weight. Margaret Hargrove had finally found her voice, and in speaking her truth, she'd taken the first real step toward finding peace.